There comes a moment, almost imperceptible, when something begins to shift inside you. Not a new thought, not a clear answer, and not a sudden revelation. It is more subtle than that. As if, for an instant, reality lowers its volume, and something quiet attempts to pass through the noise of the mind. Most people ignore this moment, because it does not arrive with intensity. It arrives with presence, a feeling difficult to explain, a subtle inner recognition, as if you suddenly sensed that something is happening beyond rational understanding. Throughout life, we learn to believe we are observing the world, but rarely do we ask something deeper. What if the world is also observing you? Not as a human entity, not as intention, but as an informational field in continuous interaction. Modern science unexpectedly approached this idea. In classical physics, the universe appeared predictable: cause, effect, motion, result. But when quantum physics explored deeper levels of matter, something strange emerged. Particles did not behave like solid objects. They existed as possibilities, potential states, open probabilities, and most intriguingly, observation seemed to influence outcome, not merely measuring reality, but participating in it. This quietly transformed a fundamental question. Perhaps you are not simply inside reality. Perhaps there is an ongoing relationship between perception and manifestation, between attention and experience, between consciousness and field. Consider something simple. How many times have you sensed something before it happened? Before evidence, before confirmation? Just a calm intuition, almost like an internal whisper, and later, the event unfolded exactly as felt. The mind calls this coincidence, but coincidence may simply be a name given to patterns not yet understood. The human brain does not only receive external information, it constantly synchronizes signals, processing millions of subtle inputs, environmental shifts, emotional tones, relational energy, information that never reaches conscious thought, yet shapes decisions and direction, which introduces a fascinating possibility. What if reality itself is partially a silent conversation, an ongoing exchange between you and the field around you? Because perhaps the field does not communicate through words, it communicates through alignment, through meaningful encounters, through repetition, through what insists on appearing in your experience, what returns, what calls attention, what asks to be noticed. The modern mind, however, lives immersed in noise, continuous thinking, continuous stimulation, continuous distraction, and when noise dominates, subtle signals disappear, not because they stopped existing, but because they stopped being perceived. Perhaps the field never stopped communicating. Perhaps we stopped listening. Notice something now. There is a part of you hearing these words. Without trying to analyze them, it simply perceives, feels meaning before explanation, recognizes familiarity without knowing why. That part does not belong to thought. It belongs to awareness. And awareness does not force answers. Awareness detects patterns. When inner speed slows, something curious happens. Events begin to feel connected. Decisions become lighter. Synchronicities appear more frequently. Not because the universe changed, but because perception aligned. Attention acts like tuning. What receives presence gains experiential reality. What remains outside attention fades from subjective experience. Perhaps living was never only about acting. Perhaps living is learning to perceive. And here arises a quiet but transformative possibility. What if the field is not waiting for action? What if it is waiting for recognition? Because perception changes everything. It creates space between impulse and action, between thought and identity, between automatic reaction and conscious awareness. Inside that small space, something new emerges, not an idea, but direct experience. Perhaps you have felt this before. A moment where everything feels present, clear, alive, effortless. A state of listening, as if reality stops being distant, and begins unfolding with you. And perhaps, without realizing, you have already begun entering that state now. In the next moments, something deeper starts to reveal itself, because understanding that the field may be communicating is only the beginning. The real question emerges when we ask, why do some people naturally perceive these signals, while others remain disconnected, even within the same reality? Perhaps what we call signs were never extraordinary events. Perhaps the extraordinary thing is simply the ability to notice what has always been present. There is something curious about human experience. We believe life unfolds only through visible actions, clear decisions, conscious movements, defined plans. Yet much of what shapes existence happens before conscious choice appears, before decision, before thought, before intention. There is an invisible moment where something has already begun. and within that silent space, the field seems to operate. Observe your own experience. How many times have you changed direction without knowing why? How often have you felt drawn somewhere, only for something meaningful to happen there? How many times have you thought about someone, and they suddenly appeared? The mind calls this coincidence, but coincidence may simply be a word used when connection remains unseen. The human brain does not perceive reality in real time. It constructs an internal model based on memory, past emotion, repeated patterns. You do not react to the world as it is. You react to the world as you learn to interpret it, and this changes everything. If perception is interpretation, then perception is also tuning. Consciousness behaves less like a passive observer, and more like a fine adjustment system, like a radio searching for frequency. Small shifts in attention transform what becomes visible. Perhaps the field does not send new messages. Perhaps it amplifies what you are already resonating with. Two people may live the same day, yet experience entirely different realities. One notices opportunity, another notices limitation. One senses connection, another feels isolation. The external world remains unchanged. Only the internal state differs, which leads to something profound. Perhaps the field does not respond to conscious desire. Perhaps it responds to sustained internal coherence, not words, not goals, but state. Because the brain continuously emits patterns, electrical signals, emotional tones, neurochemical rhythms, not merely reacting to environment, but shaping perception itself. And when perception changes, experienced reality changes. This is not magical control. It is participation. You are not separate from experience. You are part of the process generating it. This may explain why clarity often appears when control relaxes, when mental speed slows, perception expands, confusion reorganizes. Life seems to respond more to silence than to force. Psychology describes selective attention. The brain filters billions of stimuli each second. Only a tiny fraction reaches awareness, which means something remarkable. The reality you experience is only one possible selection, and selection depends on focus, expectation, emotional state. Perhaps the field never changed, perhaps attention shifted, and when attention shifts, new patterns emerge, new possibilities appear, new encounters unfold, not because they suddenly exist, but because they became perceivable. Now consider something deeper. What if signs are not external events? What if they are internal adjustments first? Subtle changes in feeling, in attraction, in meaning, in what begins calling your attention without explanation. Perhaps the field is not persuading you. Perhaps it mirrors you, reflecting repeatedly what seeks recognition, because perception is relationship, between awareness and reality, between observer and observed, between presence and experience. And within this relationship, something quiet happens. The more you force answers, the less you perceive signals. The more control softens, the clearer patterns become. Perhaps listening to the field is not learning something new. Perhaps it is unlearning mental noise, unlearning urgency, unlearning constant interpretation. Some signals appear only in pauses, in stillness, in the space between thoughts. Perhaps the field never spoke loudly. Perhaps it always spoke too softly for a restless mind. And now a deeper question begins to emerge, not intellectually, but experientially. If the field responds to inner state, what inside you is truly being heard? Thought, emotion, intention, or something deeper, existing before thought itself. In the next moments, we move into that invisible layer, because understanding communication with the field still does not explain why some people live in synchronicity, while others experience only silence. Perhaps the difference is not in reality. Perhaps it lies in how consciousness learns to listen. There is something curious about how human beings expect to receive answers. Most people imagine communication must be clear, audible, explicit, direct, a voice, an obvious sign, an undeniable confirmation. But perhaps this expectation itself prevents perception, because the field does not speak the way the human mind speaks. It does not use sentences. It does not construct arguments. It does not try to convince. The field communicates through alignment, through synchronicity, through almost imperceptible sensations. And that is why many people spend their entire lives waiting for a sign, without realizing the signs never stopped appearing. Look carefully. There are moments when you think of someone, and that person appears. Moments when an idea arises, and the environment seems to respond. Moments when something quietly says, "Do not go this way," yet the mind ignores it, because the mind was trained to trust only what it can control. But the field does not belong to control, it belongs to perception. Modern physics suggests something deeply intriguing. Before any event becomes observable reality, there exists a state of possibility, a field of probabilities, a space where multiple futures coexist, not as fantasy, but as potential. And within this field, consciousness is not merely observing, it participates. Every emotional state, every focus of attention, every silent intention acts as tuning, as if consciousness adjusts an invisible frequency, and whatever resonates with that frequency gradually emerges as experience. Perhaps the field was never distant. Perhaps you have always existed within it, breathing inside it, thinking inside it, feeling inside it, feeling inside it, yet without noticing, because we were trained to look outward, searching for answers externally, while the most constant communication happens internally. There is a subtle difference between thinking and perceiving. Thinking is mental movement, perceiving is presence. When the mind becomes noisy, perception weakens. Not because the field stopped communicating, but because the receiver lost alignment. Like an old radio, the signal never stopped transmitting, but a small frequency shift turns music into static. Most people try to change external reality, when perhaps the only adjustment needed is internal. A small shift of attention, a moment of silence, a state of observation without interpretation, and something begins to change. Coincidences increase, decisions feel natural, effort decreases, flow appears, not because life became perfect, but because resistance dissolved. Perhaps the field does not respond to effort, perhaps it responds to states. Different inner states generate different realities, not magic, but coherence. The human brain recognizes patterns. When constantly busy, it recognizes only the familiar. But when silence appears, new patterns become visible. Information always present finally becomes perceived. And then a question emerges. If the field is always communicating, what determines who perceives and who does not? Perhaps not intelligence, perhaps not knowledge, perhaps inner availability, because perception requires something rare, not knowing, not forcing meaning, simply being present enough to notice. Some people live profound experiences without understanding why. Others search intensely without ever finding answers. Perhaps the difference lies not in the field, but in inner silence. Because the field does not shout. It whispers, it does not impose, it invites, and only those who slow down enough begin to hear. Maybe you have felt this, a moment when everything seemed connected, as if reality gently responded to thought, as if something invisible organized encounters, ideas, directions, not external control, but silent cooperation, and at this point, a realization begins to form. Perhaps you are never alone in your decisions. Perhaps intuition is simply non-verbal communication from the field itself. Not a mystical voice, but relational intelligence, a continuous interaction between consciousness and possibility. And when this understanding begins, the frantic search softens. The urgency for answers fades. Curiosity replaces anxiety. Because maybe the real question was never, how do I make the field listen to me? But, am I available to listen to the field? And this question takes us even deeper. In the next moments, we explore why some people seem naturally aligned with life, while others remain disconnected, even while trying harder. There is an almost invisible point, a moment that does not appear on calendars, does not announce itself, yet completely transforms how reality is experienced. This moment does not happen outside, it happens in perception. For most of life, we believe we are observing the world, but rarely notice that what we see has already passed through countless internal filters, memories, emotional conditioning, expectations, silent fears, inherited beliefs, all acting as an invisible lens. And this lens determines what feels important, what feels threatening, what feels possible. Perhaps you have never perceived reality directly, only interpretations shaped by the mind. And this realization changes everything. Because when perception shifts, existence itself feels different. Not because the external world instantly changes, but because the observer stops operating automatically. Most people live reacting. Reacting to thoughts, reacting to emotions, reacting to stimuli, as if every sensation demanded immediate response. But there exists a subtle space between stimulus and reaction, almost unnoticed, less than a second. Yet inside that space, consciousness emerges. Neuroscience reveals something fascinating. Before you consciously decide, the brain has already initiated the decision process. Neural signals appear milliseconds before awareness, meaning many choices begin before the conscious self appears. This discovery can feel unsettling, as if freedom disappears. But perhaps freedom was never in the first impulse. Perhaps freedom exists in the moment of awareness. When you notice a thought, without immediately becoming it, something shifts. You stop being only the brain's outcome and begin participating in experience. This subtle shift transforms everything, because reality responds less to external action and more to internal state. Quantum physics describes particles existing as probabilities. Only through observation does one possibility become experience. Perhaps life functions similarly. Not a fixed destiny, but an open field of potential realities. If this is true, attention becomes participation. What receives sustained attention strengthens. What receives presence organizes experience. Patterns repeat not because life is trapped, but because attention returns to familiar internal states. The brain learns repetition. The field amplifies coherence. Reality reflects sustained inner alignment. But when the observer awakens, everything begins to change. Thoughts are noticed before identification. Emotions before reaction. Impulses before action. And in that moment, a new signal enters the field. Presence, not automation. And presence transforms experience. The field may not respond to effort. It responds to quality of awareness. Attention is directed energy. Presence organizes perception. Coherence reduces inner noise. And when noise fades, subtle perception emerges. Intuition, synchronicity, effortless alignment. Moments when life feels guided rather than controlled. Not perfection, but reduced resistance. Perhaps you have felt this before. Moments when you stopped forcing outcomes, and things aligned naturally. These moments are not accidents. They are states of consciousness. When mind and presence harmonize, perception expands. You begin noticing something profound. The field responds not only to actions, but to being. Silence becomes powerful, because silence removes interference. And when interference ends, listening begins. Most people try to understand life through thought, but deeper understanding arises before words, before explanation, before conclusion. A silent recognition. And perhaps, as you listen now, something within you is already sensing this shift. A slowing down, a deeper breath, an inner spaciousness emerging, as if awareness itself were listening. And this may be the beginning of something deeper. Because when the observer changes, the relationship with reality changes. And when that relationship changes, new possibilities become visible. Not newly created, only finally perceived. And in the next moments, we move deeper still. There exists an invisible factor, rarely discussed. That explains why some people feel constant guidance, while others remain disconnected from experience. Perhaps you are about to realize, communication has always been happening. There is something fascinating about silence. It never arrives loudly. It does not interrupt, it does not demand attention, it simply appears. When noise fades, for most of life, we search for answers outside. More information, more explanations, more effort, as if understanding existence were about accumulating knowledge. But perhaps real understanding is subtraction, removing excess thinking, removing constant interpretation, removing the urge to control what has not yet happened. Because the brain dislikes silence. It prefers motion, prediction, continuous narrative. Predictability feels safe, even when that safety is illusion. So the mind keeps generating stories about the past, about the future, about who you should become, about what must happen before you finally feel complete. But notice something now. There is a profound difference between thinking about life and experiencing life directly. Thought is representation, presence is experience, and perhaps reality. The field itself responds not to representation, but to presence. When attention is scattered, perception fragments. When attention is present, perception integrates, and within integration, something changes. You begin noticing signals that were always there, not mystical signs, not supernatural messages, but subtle internal guidance, a quiet clarity about decisions, a gentle pull toward certain directions, a calm discomfort revealing misalignment. These signals never disappeared. They were drowned out by mental noise. Perhaps the field never stopped communicating. Perhaps we never stopped talking long enough to listen. Imagine a conversation where one person speaks endlessly. Listening becomes impossible, and perhaps our relationship with reality works the same way. The more we try to control, the less we perceive. The more we force answers, the less sensitive awareness becomes. There is a silent intelligence operating beyond thought, not separate from you, but emerging when the mind stops interfering. Some call it intuition, others call it expanded awareness, others simply call it clarity. Whatever the name, the experience feels similar. You feel before understanding, you perceive before explaining, you know without needing proof. And this knowing does not shout, it whispers, a subtle certainty, an unexpected calm, a quiet sense of alignment. Perhaps this explains why nature feels transformative. The ocean does not convince, the sky does not argue. The wind asks nothing, yet something reorganizes within you because the nervous system slows. Control softens. Inner and outer fields synchronize. And when coherence appears, listening returns. Maybe nothing new is being sent. Maybe awareness is simply returning. How often have answers appeared when you stopped searching desperately? During walks, showers, moments of stillness. Not effort, but openness. Openness is listening. Science now recognizes the brain as a resonance system. It synchronizes with surrounding patterns. Calm environments regulate perception. Coherent inner states increase awareness. Meaning attention changes what becomes visible, not because reality changed, but because perception opened. Perhaps the field reflects readiness, and right now, something may be shifting silently inside you. Not a new idea, but recognition, as if part of you already knew. As if something ancient were being remembered. True communication may not be external information, but internal recognition. And when recognition happens, searching softens, resistance dissolves. Life begins to feel lighter, more aligned, more alive. Perhaps the deepest realization is not understanding the field, but realizing you were never separate from it. Always connected, always exchanging, always communicating, even without noticing. And now, a silent question may begin forming within you. If communication was always present, what changes when you truly begin to listen? That question takes us deeper still, because next, we explore why awareness suddenly brings synchronicity, clarity, and unexpected direction. Perhaps the field never changes, only the observer does. There is a very specific moment when the search begins to change direction. For years, you may have tried to understand life through effort, thinking more, planning more, controlling more, avoiding uncertainty as if life were a problem constantly needing resolution. But eventually, a quiet realization appears. Perhaps effort was never the true path. This realization does not arrive as logic, it arrives as sensation, an inner pause. As if the mind briefly stops trying to control everything. And in that pause, something new emerges. Presence. You may have felt this before, looking at the ocean, the sky, sitting silently without needing answers. And strangely, clarity appears precisely then, not when forcing solutions, but when resistance softens. The human brain evolved for survival. It predicts threats, interprets reality through past memory, meaning most reactions are not responses to the present, but echoes of the past. The brain protects you, even when no danger exists. This creates internal noise, constant thinking, over-analysis, anticipatory anxiety, a sense of urgency. But ask honestly, how often has urgency produced wisdom? How many meaningful decisions were born from anxiety? The mind may not always guide you, it may simply attempt to keep you safe, and safety is not the same as alignment. Survival prevents risk. Alignment reveals direction. Listening requires silence, not absence of thought, but freedom from automatic reaction. When you observe thoughts without obeying them, a neurological shift occurs. The nervous system slows, perception expands. What once seemed invisible becomes noticeable. Perhaps the field never started speaking, perhaps you were finally listening. How many opportunities passed unnoticed because attention was elsewhere? How many intuitions were dismissed as irrational? How many times did you know something silently, before logic intervened? There exists a deeper intelligence beyond thought, not mystical, not supernatural, but human, a perception emerging when internal noise decreases. Aligned individuals do not live without challenge, but they respond differently. They pause. They sense before acting between stimulus and response. Consciousness appears, and perhaps this is where the field becomes perceptible. Modern physics describes reality as probabilities, potential states awaiting observation. Attention collapses possibility into experience. Where attention rests, experience organizes. If attention rests in fear, reality appears threatening. If attention rests in absence, life feels lacking. But when attention rests in presence, patterns emerge, coincidences gain meaning, ideas arise naturally. Not because reality changed, but because perception opened. Perhaps the field was always present. Survival noise simply prevented listening. And now a quiet question emerges. If the field responds to inner state, who do you become when you sustain calm awareness? Who do you become when reaction slows? Who do you become when silence precedes decision? Transformation may not require adding anything new, only removing noise. Guidance rarely arrives as instruction. It appears as coherence, ease, subtle alignment. And perhaps right now, you are sensing that shift. Not answers, but space. As if urgency softens. As if searching slows. As if something inside recognizes. Nothing needed to be forced. Maybe the field operates through resonance, and resonance requires presence. Listening, allowing silence to exist. Because within silence, invisible patterns reveal themselves, and at this moment, you stop searching for signs. You begin recognizing them. Perhaps, as this video approaches its end, you notice something difficult to explain. Nothing changed around you. The same environment, the same thoughts still appear. The same world continues moving, and yet, something inside you is no longer observing in the same way. Because this video was never only about the field, never only about energy, never only about consciousness. It was a quiet invitation to notice the space where experience happens. All your life, you were taught to search outward, to look for signs, validation, direction, but perhaps true communication never came from outside. Perhaps it always emerged first within, before words, before decisions, before the identity you believe yourself to be. There exists a moment, so subtle, it almost goes unnoticed. A gap between perception and thought, between feeling and interpretation, between existence and explanation. That gap is silence. And silence is not emptiness. Silence is effortless presence. A place where no story needs defending, where no identity must be maintained, where nothing needs proving. Perhaps this is why so many spend their lives avoiding silence, mental noise, distraction, constant planning, because when silence appears, something unexpected happens. You begin to notice you are not only someone living life, you are the one aware of life unfolding. And in that moment, a silent inversion occurs. The mind continues speaking, but you are no longer fully inside it. Thoughts continue appearing, yet they no longer hold the same authority. Emotions still arise, but they no longer define you completely because something shifted, not outside, but in the position from which you observe. Perhaps this is awakening, not gaining new answers, but realizing the question was always deeper than the mind itself. And then, something profoundly liberating begins to emerge. If the field responds to attention, if reality reorganizes around awareness, if silence reveals more than effort, then life may never have been random. Perhaps there has always been a living relationship between you and that which observes you existing. Maybe the field was never controlling your life. Maybe it simply mirrors the level of consciousness you bring into each moment. Not punishment, not reward, but resonance. What you sustain internally becomes the way the world appears externally. And this changes everything. The question is no longer, why is this happening to me? It becomes, from where within me am I observing this? Because the field does not respond only to desire. It responds to the state of consciousness you inhabit. And now, perhaps you begin to sense something simple, yet transformative. Maybe you were never disconnected. Maybe separation never truly existed. Maybe seeking itself was consciousness attempting to recognize itself. And as this realization emerges, effort softens, urgency fades, fear loosens. You no longer need to force meaning. Meaning begins to reveal itself. Life stops feeling like something to control, and becomes something to listen to. And then, an inevitable question appears. If the field is always responding, if reality is always reflecting, if silence is always present, who is the one aware of all this? Who is conscious right now? Who notices this moment? Who observes thoughts as you hear these words? This question is not intellectual. It requires direct observation. Because the next step of this journey is not understanding the field. It is discovering who was never the mind trying to understand. In the next video, we enter the deepest turning point of this series. The moment you begin to realize you were never the mind who is conscious. The moment you realize you were never the mind. Continue through the playlist. Each episode reshapes how experience is perceived. Before leaving, pause for a moment. Take a slow breath. Write one single word in the comments. A word representing your current state. Silence, presence, clarity, awareness, peace. Do not think, simply notice, and write. If this space resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. This is not a place for quick answers. It is a space for deeper awareness. Share this with someone searching for signs, without realizing they are already being heard. Grateful to have you here. Much light on your path. Quanto silence.